Hi, class. So today, what we'll be doing is going over Chapter 6 of the Flippin' Packet, going over the sensitive appetite as well as the power of locomotion in one class. And so for this class, what we'll do is I'm going to share my notes with you up on the screen, and I'll be highlighting them as to show you where I am as we go through them. And what I want you guys to do is I want you to transcribe these into your notebook as if I was putting them up on the board for you guys. All right, so let's get started. So the first thing we're going to go over in more detail today is the sensitive appetite. Remember, there's three different appetites: natural appetite, and then there's the sensitive appetite and the rational appetite or the intellectual appetite. The intellectual appetite is in reference to our free will. The sensitive appetite is the emotions or the passions. So the sensitive appetite can be broken into two genera. First is the concupiscible appetite. And the concupiscible appetite is aroused by apprehension of the interior sense powers. All right, so once our common sense forms a phantasm, or the imagination presents a phantasm, or we go through our memory, or our cogitative power makes an estimation. Okay, anytime they're acting, our concupiscible appetite is then aroused, right? And what it's dealing with is it's dealing with the sensible good and evil as such, all right? It's just simply recognizing something as good or evil. And so below for you guys, I have a chart made out. So on the left-hand side with the sensible good, when we simply apprehend good as such, the appetite that's aroused is love or liking. When we perceive that the good that we apprehend is possessible, right? It's possible for us to be in possession of that good. Then the appetite of desire is aroused. And once we are in possession of a good, we then experience joy or delight. Over on the right-hand side of the chart is sensible evil. So when we apprehend that something that we sense is evil or it's bad, the immediate reaction is hatred or disliking, right? We're just simply apprehending the evil as it simply is. If we are not in possession of the evil, but we perceive it, we will then experience the emotion of aversion. All right, so that appetite pushes us away from the perceived evil. And then if we are in possession of an evil, then we are left with sadness. And so think of any time that you have been sad, it's because you have been dealing with, an evil that you're in possession of. Something bad has happened, okay, that you apprehended as simply bad, and the result is sadness. Whereas in times when you're happy or you're filled with joy, it's because you perceive that you are in possession of some good that you have desired. All right, so moving on, the second genus of the sensitive appetite is the irascible appetite. Oops. Up here. All right, the irascible appetite. The irascible appetite is aroused only by the cogitative power. And the reason why we say that only the cogitative power is responsible is because the irascible appetite is only aroused if we recognize a particular difficulty associated with particular goods or evil. And so what's happening there is a particular judgment has to be made that, I desire, let's say, ice cream, okay? However, the ice cream is going to be difficult to obtain. So a judgment has been made there by the cogitative power in this particular instance. And so because now there's some level of difficulty associated with the good perceived, or if there's an evil that's coming, like say there's a spider and you have aversion to that evil, but you perceive for some reason that it would be difficult to avoid the evil of the spider. Well, then what's going to happen is the irascible appetite is going to kick in. And the irascible appetite is, as St. Thomas says, a servant to the concupiscible appetites. And the reason for that is because it responds to what is recognized by the concupiscible appetite and then strives to obtain or avoid it for the sake of the concupiscible appetite. So first we recognize something as good and we love it. All right. And then if it's difficult to achieve it, well, then the irascible appetite will kind of come in as the knight in shining armor is one way to think of it, and go through the struggle that's required in order to obtain the good, or go through the struggle that's required in order to remove the evil that has become present. All right. So below here, I have another chart for you guys, and this lays out the irascible appetite, the irascible passions, the irascible emotions. And so the way they're divided is into positive emotions and negative emotions. So on the positive side, on the left-hand side, the first is hope. So the irascible appetite of hope is experienced whenever we recognize that a good can be obtained with some difficulty. So think of the instance of getting to heaven. All right, we all would like to get to heaven. That's a good that we recognize. However, it's going to be difficult to get there. You have to get through the whole journey of life. And so the virtue that's required, right, or like, the appetite that virtue disciplines is hope. All right, you have the motivation to continue to strive, all right, for that goal, for that good, even though it's going to be difficult. Next is courage. Courage is the other positive emotion or appetite, sometimes called daring. Courage is what's aroused when we recognize that there's an evil and it's going to be difficult to avoid, but we believe that we truly can avoid the evil. And so maybe you have a difficult class that you're signed up for, and the evil that needs to be avoided is a bad grade. Okay. And so if you have a response of like, well, I can avoid having a bad grade, I can, avoid that bad thing from happening. In that instance, that's the emotion of courage that's taking place. Okay. It's going to be difficult to avoid, having a failing grade from this very difficult professor or what have you, but you're going to proceed anyway. The next positive emotion is anger. And so the reason we have the emotional response of anger is when we are dealing with the present evil. Okay. So think about it. You never get angry when something good happens. Okay. It's always when something bad happens. And what anger is there to do is it's meant to give us the energy to rid ourselves of an evil that we are in possession of. Okay. So think of like a just example of anger. You can think of Christ when he's in the temple in the court of the Gentiles, and he drives out the money changers and those who are buying and selling animals to be sacrificed. Okay, so there was an evil present there, and what it was the sacrilege of the temple, right? Insult of God. And Christ, perceiving that in his righteousness, he experienced the emotion of anger. And what that did was it gave him the fuel and the energy, right, in his human nature to then rid himself of that evil, to rid the evil from the area, right? So he makes a whip of cords and he starts, forcing people out and overturning the tables. One of the nice things to know within this Thomistic framework then is it helps you would be able to discern when anger is just or when anger is irrational and should be put away with. So sometimes we get angry at situations that we can't change, okay? So if you're in a situation that you can't change, and you're dealing with anger, well, then it's time for the intellect and the will to come in and say, well, hang on here. There's nothing that can be done, and so my anger isn't going to go anywhere. It's not going to produce anything good in this situation. In that case, then you would want to start, weaning yourself off from the emotion. All right. But when there's legitimate evils that are present, where you need the extra energy to, overcome an obstacle. So, like, say you're a parent and your child is misbehaving. Okay, anger can be a useful tool to, drive a lesson home with a child who isn't hearing what you're trying to get them to understand anyway. Okay, and by having that added energy, you can rid yourself of the evil of the misbehaving child, correcting their bad actions. All right, the second set on the right-hand side are the negative emotions. And the as you probably picked up with the example of anger, just because there's on one side the positive, and the other side's the negative. I'm not saying that these emotions are always good, or on the left-hand side, and the emotions on the right-hand side are always negative. What that means is that it's how you are perceiving the good or the evil. You're perceiving it in a positive light with hope, right? Oh yeah, this can be obtained. Whereas despair, the first of the negative ones, is where you perceive the good in a negative light. This is unable to be possessed, and thus you despair. So despair is the emotion when you desire good, but you believe you can no longer obtain it. And this is what another example connecting to our journey towards heaven. Despair is the sin when your will assents to this emotion of thinking that heaven cannot be achieved. Okay, and when you enter into that kind of despair, you're doubting God's ability to forgive your sins. Okay, and so that type of despair should always be avoided, but in a more simple way. Let's say you were hoping that your parents were going to take you to McDonald's or whatever on the way home, and then as you drive past the restaurant, they clearly did not stop in the drive-thru for you. Well, then you experience despair, right? Like, oh, I was hoping to possess this good. However, now I recognize that the good is unattainable, and so you're left with this despairing feeling. All right, there's no way they'll turn the car around to get it, and then you'll eventually, it quickly falls into sadness then, because you're left with the evil of being deprived of a McFlurry or chicken nuggets or whatever it was that you wanted from that restaurant. The second negative emotion is fear. Fear is what occurs when you perceive an evil and it's approaching, and you don't think there's anything you can do to avoid it. So it's natural to experience fear. So let's say you're going out swimming in the ocean and you're caught in a riptide and you're being pulled out into the sea. Well, you recognize that, oh my goodness, I'm being pulled out into the sea. There's a very good chance that I might continue to be pulled out and drown. All right. And so you perceive this seems a little unavoidable, and then fear kicks in. All right. It's like another adrenaline rush. It can give you the energy to try your best, but really what's happening there is you're perceiving that this isn't going to end well. And that's how fear kicks in. And so again, this also will help with, some people are more prone to fear than others. I think, is the fear rational? So some people are afraid of spiders, right? It's like, what's the evil that's actually unavoidable? They're having to look at it. Do you think it's going to attack you? And so, given the fact that you're a rational human being, that's another instance where you need to make an act of the will, okay, and start trying to overcome those kinds of giving into those kinds of emotions, because they're not playing into, how human nature is designed, how to the purpose it actually serves. So then you'll notice that at the bottom, there is nothing there in the negatives. Because anger, as you'll notice, hope correlates with despair, courage correlates with fear. there's nothing that correlates with anger, because if you you never try to rid yourself of a present good, that wouldn't make sense, okay? And if you can't rid yourself of a present evil, well, then you're just simply left with sadness because you're in possession of it. And so for that reason, there's only 5 irascible appetites, whereas you see up here, there's 6 concupiscible appetites. All right, so a really interesting question that Thomas raises is, are the appetites subject to reason? And the initial answer that you might expect would be no, because it seems that emotional people can be quite irrational, and you can experience emotions, and they seem to be beyond your control at times. However, Thomas says that the appetites are in fact subject to reason. All right, he answers yes. And so he makes a distinction between 2 different types of control: despotic versus political. So he says that despotic rule is like the rule of a tyrant whose will is law. He gives a command and it's followed through. And so he says that reason has despotic rule over powers such as locomotion. All right. So if you decide to make an act of will to raise your hand, your body will raise its hand. All right. There is no rebellion that goes on there. Okay. In the natural order of things. With your emotions, though, you don't have that same type of despotic rule. All right. You can't just will yourself to be angry or will yourself to be happy. What Thomas says the appetites are subject to is political rule. And so he says in political rule, a king or a ruler who's not a dictator will have to persuade his subjects, right? Or if you're someone who is elected into office by a democracy, you have to persuade the people who vote for you in order to get a law to go through. And so he says that the intellect is able to govern the appetites by means of persuasion via phantasms. All right, so the reason, you can make an act of the will to present a phantasm in your imagination. And by presenting that phantasm, right, that object that you associate as either good or bad, you can persuade your appetites, right, to then follow suit upon that phantasm. Okay, so for example, think of what makes you happy, and then you think of a Christmas from your early childhood, okay, and all the great memories that it has with that. That is how the intellect, right, by the act of the will and the intellect guiding the interior sense powers, going through that memory and presenting that positive image, you have a political type of control over happiness, okay? Like you can be recalled of that memory and kind of experience a delight within that memory, right? But it always takes place by means of phantasms. You can arouse anger in yourself, right? If you start to think of people who dislike you, or if you start to think too much about politics, but you can intentionally present those phantasms by means of your intellect. And then by doing that, you're persuading the appetites to follow suit. All right. And so this is why sometimes in moral theology, we say that you are culpable for your emotions sometimes if there's an act of the will that follows them. Okay. So you can have sinful anger. But just simply experiencing anger isn't in and of itself sinful. It becomes a sin, though, when your act of the will gets involved, okay, and then your intellect, gives in or starts consenting to, continuing to dwell on phantasms that then drive yourself towards anger. All right. So now that we've kind of covered what's in the packet, I just wanted to go over some interesting Thomistic principles in psychology in the emotions. So, 1, phantasms stored in the imagination are what cause our emotional responses. All right, that was the idea we talked about just up above how the intellect can govern the emotions as a type of political rule. Disordered emotions in an individual can be fixed by addressing the phantasm that's in the imagination. Okay, so here's an easy example to understand. Let's say you meet someone and they leave a bad first impression on you and you don't like them. Okay, so when you think of that person, the phantasm that's presented of that person arouses all these negative feelings, right? Of like distrust, anger, aversion. You don't really like them. Okay. Let's say after you meet them, you get to know them over the course of a year. What's happening over that year is your phantasm of that person is changing because you're not simply left with, a first impression. But what's actually happening is you're getting to know the actual person. And so your phantasm is becoming more and more informed. And as your phantasm changes, well, then your emotional response to that person will also change. They might become like one of your best friends. And so whereas the phantasm presented in the imagination used to arouse like dislike, aversion, sadness when you're stuck with this person in the same group, you get to know them better and the phantasm changes, and then everything changes. It's like, oh, I like this person. I would like to hang out with this person. It's fun to hang out with this person. All right, so disordered emotions can be fixed by fixing the phantasm. Another example of this is forgiveness. So forgiveness can heal a relationship that is often emotionally distressing. And so another example of this would be, forgiving a parent who has been a failure in a major way. Okay. Lots of people have parents who have, failed. Right? Everyone has parents who have failed to some degree, but some parents have really, really screwed up. And that leaves, a huge lasting impact on the child who then grows up into being an adult. All right. And so, the act of forgiveness in that instance is critical in the healing process. And so when you can forgive someone, all right, what's happening is you're making this act of the will, and your will's guiding your cogitative power. And the associations you have with the phantasm of, say, your father, okay, begin to change because you are trying to change the way that you see that person. Okay. Maybe instead of recognizing, not like you might think of a father as someone who, completely failed, and it's just the epitome of the reason why your life is horrible. Training yourself to see them as someone who's human and fallen, and maybe they had their own horrible mistakes in life, and that doesn't excuse them, right? And then you make the act of will to forgive. Okay, that can, when you begin to habituate yourself to forgive someone whenever the phantasm is presented, that can lead to long-term healing. All right. So it always has to do with the phantasm and how the cogitative power, has judged it. That's what needs to be retrained sometimes. A second example that's pretty common for a lot of people is the cycle of rumination. All right. So the cycle of rumination is a process where someone has become addicted to sadness. Typically happens when people deal with a broken heart, as the poets express it. So example of rumination, how it might take place is this. All right. So number one, a boy sees a girl who rejected him. Maybe they used to date for like a couple years, and then she broke up with him. All right. And then he's going about his business, and then he sees the girl. All right. He's sad then after he sees her because the side of her recalls the phantasm of her in the imagination. Okay. And the phantasm of his whole idea of the relationship and whatnot and how it's ended. Okay. And so that evil's present, that causes sadness. In sadness, all right, if you think about it, we talk about how we don't like to be sad, sadness gives a kind of pleasure Okay. And that's where the addicting part can come in. And so he can ruminate on his sadness, right? It's called feeling sorry for yourself, is another way we commonly express it. Okay. There's something soothing about that process, or there's something soothing about the feeling. All right. And it's meant to kind of assuage the hurt. All right. And we can get addicted to that feeling of, feeling assuaged by our sadness. All right. So after he gets, addicted to the sadness, and he just dwells on that and dwells on it, and he kind of milks the emotion dry because emotions are fleeting. They're limited in how long they can last. The emotional effect begins to wear off. And then the next day, the boy sees the girl again, and then his whole cycle resumes. Okay. And so he sees her, phantasm is presented. Okay. It's been a day or two. So emotionally, he's recharged, right? He's recharged his battery, so to speak, to be sad. And then he kind of goes down that path again. So in both the examples above, it requires an act of the will and a retraining of the cogitative power to kind of break out of these cycles that these emotional cycles that people can end up in. And it's definitely a process. Okay. And, talking it through, right. And having, getting things off your chest, so to speak, is a good way to, process what's happening intellectually. And they're not good places to be. So there are Thomistic psychologists. And what they do is they kind of walk people through in their counseling with the understanding of like, okay, what we need to address is the phantasm. And, try to help them to perceive the phantasm and recognize like, hey, this is happening because you're addicted to sadness. Like having that realization can be a huge lift in someone who's saying stuck in a cycle of rumination to, make them aware of like, oh, well, maybe I need to start making those small acts of the will to try to break out. In both these examples, there's also instances where people's the physical side of themselves is damaged, so to speak. All right, so it's for these examples, it's this would be like someone who's typically healthy. Okay, this is a process you need to go through to address these issues. But sometimes, as natures generate, right, things can become corrupted. And so if your emotional powers, we talked about how like the imagination can be corrupted in the sense of like it's not working as it's supposed to. Same thing with the cogitative power. And that kind of explains like insane people. Sometimes the physical side that produces emotions is breaking down or what have you. And in that instance, something else in addition to just simply counseling and acts of the will may be needed. But again, this isn't a full-blown psychology class. But I'm just like making you aware of like, different principles that are used in psychology, in Thomistic psychology. Very different from Freudian psychology, which is what modern psychology is based off of. All right. Which makes sense because, your philosophy of human nature, how you see the human being, is going to impact your understanding of how to help their psyche, right? Which is Greek for their soul. If you have a different understanding of man, well, then you'll address man's problems in a different manner. Okay, so the last note is locomotion. Locomotion is just a means of following the sensitive and intellectual appetites. All right, because animals perceive things outside them, it makes sense then. When they recognize the good, they can desire good. Well, now they can move towards that good. There's nothing too deep about locomotion, right? All right, so that is class for today. Next class, we'll move on to the rational powers of the soul, and I'll be given a new handout of the flippin' packet for that. So I will see you later. God bless. Take care.